You know, friends, one of the things that we know for certain as Christians is that there's an awful lot wrong in this world. And that can be frustrating and annoying and discouraging and all kinds of different emotions. We try to hang in there. We endeavor to stick with it. We try to keep a stiff upper lip. We try to look for the silver lining. And yet there are times, especially these days, when what we recognize when we're honest, quietly putting our heads on the pillow at night, is that what's wrong with this world is primarily me. I'm not contributing to the righteousness of this world. I'm contributing to the misery. And apart from Christ, that could be an incredibly hopeless perspective, couldn't it? We know the passage in Romans chapter 3 that there are none righteous, no, not even one. But when we take that from being a bumper sticker or a flannel graph or something that we just throw out there, usually at others, not at ourselves, it can be tough to recognize that I'm annoying, I'm frustrating, I'm discouraging. I'm the one who's being spoken about in Romans 3. Verse 10 says, "No one is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks after God. All have turned aside. Together they become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouths full of curses, bitterness. Feet swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. In the path of peace they have not known. There's no fear of God before their eyes." And, you know, that can become a really discouraging thing when we acknowledge that before the Lord. And as we know, that the beginning of Christianity is the beginning of acknowledgement that we ourselves really are, as the Apostle Paul said, the worst sinners that we know. It's hard to acknowledge, hard to come to grips with, not easy to admit, painful to think about. And yet that glorious passage in Romans chapter 3 is followed by Romans chapter 4, that God justifies the ungodly. God doesn't come and make people right with him who are already right with him. He makes the ungodly, those people in Romans 3, there's none righteous, no, not even one. And so when chapter 4 tells us that God justifies ungodly people like us, and chapter 5 reminds us that since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God, then there's something about striving to walk in a way that pleases God. And there's something very liberating about this little account that I'd like to share with you. Tim Challies, who I've mentioned a number of times, wrote this, and I've had it on my desktop for some months now. And when we think about the idea of trying to do our best, not in order to be saved, because that's impossible, but when we are saved, to living the best way we can, I think Challies gives us some real encouragement that I hope will encourage you as you consider the Lord's Day tomorrow. He says, the devotional writer from a bygone era believed it was crucial to carefully distinguish faultlessness from blamelessness. For while we cannot live faultlessly in this world, we may live blamelessly. Even the best deeds we can do, they cannot be faultless when we ourselves are so very imperfect, and when this world is so firmly arrayed against us. Yet, we as believers may still remain blameless before the Lord, even in light of our many imperfections. He says a fictional illustration may serve here. Let's suppose a day came when my father, a landscaper, was hired by one of our neighbors to design and install a garden. He dutifully sat before his grafting table to create a design, visited the nursery to purchase the plants, stood in the garden and began to create the shape of the different flower beds. But serious illness overcame him, and he was forced to remain indoors for many days. And though at the time I was merely a child, I was a son who loved his father, so took it upon myself to surprise him by completing the project on his behalf. I studied the plans as I could, carved the shape of the different beds, put down a layer of topsoil, planted the ferns and hostas, the roses, and doing my absolute best to lay them out exactly where the plans dictated. Now, when my father recovered, when he recovered sufficiently to venture out of doors, I led him to that garden and happily presented him the work I had done for him. His reaction was both joy and concern. He felt great joy that I had attempted to serve and to please him, and that I had done my best with the little knowledge and minimal skill that I possessed. But he also felt concerned that the job was done more poorly than he would have done it. Notice the flower beds were not quite the right shape. The edges were ragged, and many of the plants and flowers were a little out of place. He knew there was still some work to do to make it right. As I stood before my dad and proudly displayed the work I had done for him, I would have been blameless, even though the work was not faultless. The work was, in fact, the farthest thing from faultless. It was clumsy, messy, amateurish, in no way up to the standards my father could have maintained on his own. So, judged by his standard, it was a failure. But though the work was not faultless, I was still blameless, for I had done the absolute best I could with the little knowledge and the little skill that I possessed. My motives were good, my desires were good, and my work was as good as I could make it. How would a father respond in such a situation? He would commend his son for his love, generosity, and desire to honor his father. He would not castigate his son for his lack of knowledge or lack of skill, but rather would honor his desire to please his father to the degree that he was able. Now, this illustration aptly illustrates the work that we do for God in the world. Such work is never faultless, for even our best deeds are still imperfect in their execution and marred by some degree in their motive. Even our best work falls short of perfect execution, but we may well be blameless before the Lord when we do our work to the best of our ability, and when we do our utmost to cleanse our heart and purify our motives. God accepts and treasures such work, not because it's perfect, but because it proceeds from faith and love. Had I done that gardening on my father's behalf, it is conceivable that he might have snapped some photographs of my work, might even have showed them to me in later life. I have no doubt I would have cringed, for from a more mature perspective, I would have seen just how amateurish my work was. I would have known that I could have done much better today, but his motive would not have been to mock me, not to express disappointment, but to remind me of how I'd done the best I could with the little that I had, and how I'd done it all to honor the one I loved, and the one who loved me. And in that way, shouldn't we believe that God treasures what we do, however feeble, however immature, bungled, or blundered it is? For though what we do is most certainly not faultless, it is any father's joy to count his children as blameless. Friends, I hope that is an encouraging thought to you as we prepare ourselves today to come into the church on Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, live and in person, here at Downsview Baptist Church. Be encouraged, brothers and sisters. The Lord is with you. Cheers.